Bally bathes in Pacman Gold, Mattel to develop VCS titles, and the FCC gives cell phones the green light. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
It makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the video game and home computer industries. Today we'll be traveling back 40 years to February of 1982. I'm Carl, and as almost always now, I'm joined by my co-host, Mads. Welcome back, Mads.
Well, thanks for having me again, mate.
Yeah, sorry. Peter's been out. He got himself a case of the COVID, so
okay.
Mads, thanks for jumping in.
Well, that seems to be popular these days, so all the kids want it.
Hey, how else are you going to get out of class, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, we have a metric ton of stuff to do today, but before we do that, I did want to just very quickly say you just recently did a massive episode of the Retro Asylum going over one of the greatest games of all time, Secret of Monkey Island.
We did indeed, yeah. It was kind of a special one because we've been planning that, Chris and I, for like years. Actually, we wanted to do a huge episode on all of the Monkey Island series. But Chris had the great idea that instead of just me and him who've been playing the game since they came out back in the day, just wax lyrical about it for hours on end, we were actually joined by Jim and Andy from the Playthrough podcast who've never played them before, never played any Monkey Island games before. So they both played for the first time ever Monkey Island, and we discussed that. So that was good fun. Yeah,
it's a great episode. I'm about halfway through it at this point. And it's really fun to see that very different perspective of somebody who's coming to it with fresh eyes. Since, I'm like you, I played it when the games came out. At this point, five or six of them at this point. It's 5, right?
It's 5, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, lose track of time. I'm getting old.
Yeah.
It's a really, really entertaining one. And I could not let this go by without mentioning it at least.
Yeah, so I'll probably never forgive Andy and Jim for actually they played the remastered version, which of course lets you switch between the remastered graphics and the beautiful old pixel art. And they both said that they found the pixel art ugly and switched to the new graphics. So I'll probably never forgive them for that. But apart from that, it was a good episode.
You can't. But okay, and this is where my Amiga bias is going to come in. As someone who completed the game for the first time on the Amiga. Mm-hmm. First time I played it was on a PC, but the first time I completed it was on Amiga. Yeah, there's something to be said for playing it on an RGB monitor that really makes that old pixel art look even better than if you play it on a crisp VGA screen.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. But of course, nobody should ever play Monkey Island 2 on an Amiga. That's just an atrocity. Don't go there.
As someone who did.
Me too, actually. I did too. 11, 12 discs, something like that. A lot of disc swapping. But,
it's still not as bad as Fate of Atlantis. That had even more discs.
Did it? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Fate of Atlantis, I think it was Monkey Island 2 may have only been 8 or 9, but okay. Fate of Atlantis was 12 or 14. It was just this massive pile of discs. It was scary.
Yeah, but picking those games up today, do please play Monkey Island 2 on the PC. Monkey Island 1 you can play on the Amiga if you want, but do play Monkey Island 2 on the PC.
I concur 100%. Yes. Especially nowadays when you have Roland emulation. I mean, back then, if you were playing it with a PC speaker, even a Sound Blaster, it almost sounded better on the Amiga. But once you put that Roland soundtrack on it, it's so nice.
As soon as you had a Sound Blaster or Sound Blaster 16, I guess you'd be at a 16, and then the iMuse system that actually changed the musical tracks according to what was happening on screen. Yeah. That was just brilliant, and it wasn't there on the Amiga at all. iMuse wasn't implemented for the Amiga at all.
No, it wasn't. You did have really nice renditions of the tunes, but it didn't have that dynamic sound. And on a regular Sound Blaster, it already sounded nice. It's just it was a luxury thing to have back in the day.
True.
Yeah. Oh, well. Okay. So that the links to both the Retro Asylum and your other podcast,
the Playthrough
podcast, thank you, are in the show notes. So people definitely go check those out. And we should also just plug right here, if you want to support this show, links to the Patreon are down below, as well as links to all of our Twitter and Instagram and all that good rot, blah, 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 blah. If you've been here before, you've heard the spiel. Now,
let me say, all the cool kids support the show, so go ahead.
As do you. Yes. As do you.
That's what I meant, mate.
If you are one of those cool kids, you get to watch the video version of our very first segment of the show today, which is the 7 Minutes in Heaven. The segment where the co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a publication dated February 1982. And remember, for purposes of all of our news, we're always using publication dates, which obviously mean the events happened at some point earlier. And for our purposes today, Mads is being sent back to the arcades of the early 80s to play none other than Kickman. Mads, are you ready?
I was born ready, mate.
Excellent. Then off you go. Welcome back, Mads, from your 7 Minutes in Heaven. So, to those who have not played Kickman before, how would you describe it based on your 7 minutes with the game?
So how to describe Kickman? So you're a clown on a unicycle, and you have to catch some balloons falling down. It was a bit hard to play it because it's supposed to be played with a huge trackball, and I was playing it just with a joypad. Or an arcade stick, really. So there was no acceleration when I was moving back and forth, but you're supposed to have that. So maybe if you want to try to play this, try it with a mouse, if that's possible in MAME. So 3 different colors of balloons fall down. The yellow ones fall slowly, the red ones faster, and the blue ones really, really fast. And you need to, in the first level, pop the balloons with your hat. The second level, you need to stack them on top of your hat. They'll just stack on top of each other. And whenever you get, I'd like to say 8 balloons or something like that, they disappear. Or when you pick up a Pac-Man, which is also a part of this crazy game, there are some, instead of balloons at the top, there will be Pac-Man there. If you pick up one of those guys, they will eat all of the balloons. And that's, I guess that's pretty much it. Then you just get harder and harder levels, and the balloons fall faster and faster, and you need to pick them all up and rack up a high score. So a classic high score challenge for the arcade from the early 80s.
Very cool. And it's kind of bizarre because you're a clown on a unicycle, which is not the most common of protagonists for a video game.
No, true. And it's got this nice circus tune as well. Nice little ditty playing along. So that was pretty cool. But this is a game I know from back in the day, not from the arcade. Never tried the arcade version before, but from the C64, and I enjoyed playing it there. So it was fun picking it up on the arcade as well. I wish I tried it with a trackball, but that'll be for a later time.
Very cool. Yeah, and as a weird historical oddity, I mean, it's not one of the most famous games of all time. It only gets with that one port to the C64. But the fact that it's got Pac-Man in it, it's like the lost Pac-Man cousin. And it's coming out in magazines the same month that Miss Pac-Man is also showing up. So it's clear that Bally is, riding the coattails of Pac-Man in a big way and trying to incorporate him in as many games as they can.
Yeah. Pac-Mania is just about to really take off.
Oh yeah, it's already hitting big. Don't just wait until the cartoon hits, because
True.
the cartoon is really what's going to solidify it and give it legs, because that thing runs for years.
Yeah.
So, okay. So would you recommend that somebody load up Kickman?
Yes, it's great fun. It's a great adventure, not adventure. It's a great arcade classic, really, for me at least, because I know the C64 version. So if you do have access to a trackball, or maybe you could try it on a mouse, yes, pick it up. It's a good high school challenge.
Cool.
And
awesome.
Otherwise, pick up the C64 version. If I recall correctly, it's quite good. So, and that is, of course, is tweaked to be played with a joystick.
Perfect. Then everybody, you have your recommendations from Mad, so go and pop some balloons and some Pac-Man or something.
And some Pac-Man, yes, and some ghosts as well. Yeah.
Okay. When that being said, we have one more segment before we can turn on the time machine, and that is to check in with our good friend Ethan for the Department of Corrections. Welcome back, Ethan. So let's find out what I got wrong in our January 1982 jump.
And what you get wrong all the time. You have to remember that. You remember last time you took away all of your goodwill for the Department of Corrections for the rest of the year. So I'm going to have to lay it on you thick. All right, Carl?
Okay, lay it on me. Lay it on me.
All right, but before we jump straight into corrections, we will talk about the Mads comment. Get mad. Get mad.
And he commented?
He was confused about the flipperless pinballs and the bingo machines. Or maybe this would have been you. I forget exactly, but I have this as a comment for Mads. Bingo pinball machines very explicitly do not have flippers. Bingo was a hearkening back to the old style of pinball games in a gambling context. There's a whole podcast about bingo pinball games if you want to go listen to it. Nick Baldrich's For Amusement Only podcast. I mean, it covers other regular pinballs as well, but it's the electromechanical pinball and bingo podcast. So that's one of the main subjects.
Cool.
So if you want to learn about bingo, head on that way.
Okay, I'll add a link in the show notes.
And now, Department of Corrections, red pens, bad vibes, all over the place. All right.
Let's do it.
Get ready. Yeah. All right. So first of all, you said Dragon's Lair is 2 years away. And no, indeed not. It will come in June 1983.
Ah, okay. Yeah. It's 1 year away. 1.5.
1.5. Yes. Right around there. As this was a whole Laserdisc section, we are talking more about Laserdisc. And the person who put together the what is it called? Adventures in Videoland, thing that you guys played. His name is pronounced K. Savets.
Oh, Savets. Okay, cool.
Yeah, Savets. Who, of course, runs the Antic Atari 8-Bit podcast.
Oh, he's actually the guy who... Oh, you mean the modern version, not the original file.
Yeah, the original was by... oh, man, I can't remember his name right now. But, yeah, he implemented it for him. Cool. We talked about that a little bit behind the scenes when you were trying to set it all up. Also, you misplaced the year of the film that this was based on, Roller Coaster, which was a 1977 film.
Ah, okay.
Don't remember what year exactly you said it was, but it is definitely a 70s film, and it is just kind of a lame disaster horror movie thing. It's not very good.
No, it's not good. No, it's not.
I have no idea why this movie specifically was chosen. Well, we do have some idea why it was chosen. Why did he have that movie in the first place? That's the real question. Anyway, and also you said that this might be the first public use of a Laserdisc game, but no, indeed. At the 1981 AMOA, there was the first Laserdisc coin-op game on the show floor, which was Quarter Horse.
That was one of those horse betting games, right?
Yes. So, it's not particularly an amusement game. And there were other interactive experiments with Laserdisc, but you'll get to read about that in my book, because there's going to be a whole chapter about Laserdisc.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Okay, next up, we're talking about the C64. You said that you could not reuse any code from the VIC-20 on the C64, but that is not accurate because VIC-20, I mean, it's all 6502, but VIC-20 assembly you can use on the C64. You do have to change some things, but that's still a reuse of code in a typical sense because most of the graphical modes that were available on the VIC-20 can be used on the C64.
And that's where you're wrong, dead wrong. The graphic modes are completely different between the two systems. The only thing that they have consistent graphically is PETSCI.
Yeah, the text mode. That is a graphical mode.
No. And we have to make a couple of distinctions here because in, for example, C64 Basic and VIC-20 Basic, you can establish foreground and background colors for the PETSCI. Unfortunately, yes, because the color palettes between the VIC and the VIC-2 chip are completely different, you're going to get a completely different result if you try to port the code over. And also, the VIC-20 doesn't have nearly the same number of columns as the Commodore 64, which is also going to distort any kind of graphics that you try to produce that way.
Now, I'm pretty sure that I've seen people use the PETSCI text mode and pretty much directly port the from the VIC-20 to the C64.
Now, only if they're using it in a monochrome or they have to completely redesign the color schemes. They're going to have to redo that. But that's still
code. The code is transferred over.
Well, the basic is the same. I mean, it's the same basic that was on the PET. So in that set, if you're just using basic, also remember that the basic that they're using doesn't actually give you any commands to generate anything relevant for sound or actual sprite drawing. All of that has to be done with memory.
You said
calls.
You cannot transfer code from the VIC-20 to the C64, and you're wrong.
Well, but that would be like saying that the BASIC on the Apple II is compatible with it because you could theoretically use the same BASIC calls. That's not transferring the code. The code would be something that you actually stored on a disk or something. The disks, the media is not even compatible. You can't load a program off of a disk. You'd have to retype it.
Right. I mean, the assembly is different, but the code can theoretically be the same, even if you're going to get different colors. But I'll just leave that there.
They're not
Commodore freak over here. I didn't say compatible. Yeah, I said that you can reuse the code. But yeah, anyway, let's put it.
Yeah, let's move on.
There's that. There's
and
the
they're
argument.
not both 6502. 6510 on the C64.
Well, yeah, 6510. The assembly. So,
okay.
So next. Oh, all right. Next up, you're into a divergence about aircraft companies. And you said that, this one particular aircraft company, I forget what the context was quote unquote the Wright aircraft company, but that is not true. There were several Wright aircraft companies. There were several companies that took the name of Wright and had the right to use the Wright patents. Yes, I know this is confusing, but there's no singular Wright company that continued to exist after the time of the Wright brothers, basically. There were several.
Okay. Yeah, these guys basically are using it as one of their ad issues on their website. And the reason we were talking about them was because they had created a simulator, a flight simulator back, I think, in the 50s or 60s. Yeah.
Yeah, there are several companies that had Wright attached to their name. So there's no, like, the Wright Brothers Aircraft Company or whatever it was called there at the beginning does not exist anymore. So if there was a quote unquote the Wright company, that would be it, and it doesn't.
Gotcha.
So
okay, cool.
Next up, another thing of the old stuff, talking about the early days of pinball. I think you said that D. Gottlieb & Co. was always against gambling, and that is not true. This became kind of a marketing angle that D. Gottlieb used, but it was not. It was not always the case. In fact, back in 1932, they were going to introduce a payout pinball machine. It's not 100% clear how this was going to work, but he did advertise it. The game appears never to have come out with the payout. But if he was completely morally against a payout, then he wouldn't have even tried. So
No, that's true. That is definitely okay. That's cool. So I like the idea that they were thinking about doing it, and then they decided, it's better publicity if we don't. Or at least that's
yeah. I mean, this became kind of a dividing line later in the 50s, basically. Like Bally was big into the payout machines, and then Gottlieb was against them, and then there was kind of an organizational battle between them. But yeah, Gottlieb did indeed dip their toe into the gambling side, but then decided to get out.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. That actually fits in nice.
Then after that, you did a coverage on it was Replayer Playmeter coverage on a news story that ran about the Blue Sky operators. And in fact, I have a copy of that particular story that I uploaded because Frank Fogelman, head of Gremlin, happened to record it on VHS.
Oh, cool.
So you can add that to the show notes there, and you can see exactly what the whole deal was about.
Yeah, and I watched that video. That's absolutely fascinating stuff. Everybody needs to go and watch this video immediately. Link is in the show notes. These people being scammed, and it's pure 1980s investigative TV journalism too. So that just adds to it. But these people buying, when you see the games running, you're just like, seriously, who the frag in their right mind would have thought that was a cutting edge game at that moment? It's
that's the thing about the Blue Sky operators. They prey on the people who don't really have a great view of this stuff. They just know video games are hot. Put a video game in front of them, then they will pay for it to be put in a bad location.
Well, especially at that moment with the recession going on and everything else, it really was a time to take advantage of people.
And it was the same at the beginning of the 70s when the Blue Sky operators were running amok. I have a story that I'm working on specifically about that, so keep an eye on that for the future.
Definitely. As soon as you got it, let me know. We'll add it to the show notes.
Will do. And related to this story, you said that there was some company called Centauri that you didn't really know anything about, and I must slap you for your ignorance on this, Carl. For Centauri was one of the 6 biggest U.S. distributors of arcade games. They were
a distributor.
Well, they were a manufacturer. So yeah, I shouldn't have said it that way. They were one of the biggest manufacturers next to Sega, Atari, Bally, all those people. The thing is that they mainly did not do in-house development. Mainly what they were doing was taking stuff from Japanese companies and a couple British companies as well. Their most famous game is probably Phoenix, which it was imported from a question mark company because we don't actually know who made it. And their one in-house is rare and legendary among arcade collectors. Was called Pleiades. I don't know exactly how that is, but yeah, Centauri. You should know Centauri. Even though that a lot of their product was not very memorable, they were still a very, very big company.
Cool. Okay, I will have to dig in deeper.
Yeah, so they were made out of the ashes of the company Allied Leisure, who we'll probably be covering next year as you get into the Pong stuff.
So wait, they were carved out of Allied Leisure?
Allied Leisure went bankrupt. The assets were bought from Allied Leisure, and Centauri was.
Okay. That makes a little bit more sense. I mean, I'm very familiar with Allied Leisure, so okay, cool.
And after that, you talk about Sega Gremlin, but you said David Rosen was the chairman of Sega Gremlin, but there were no chairman of Sega Gremlin. There were only chairman of Sega Enterprises, Inc., which was the company that owned Sega Gremlin.
Gotcha. Okay. Good. Minor issue, but definitely something, a distinction worth noting.
Yes, and again, this will be something for the book. So you will learn all about the organizational structure of Sega in the 1980s from this book. For
a very complicated complicated history, as I've already noted in a few times in Alex Smith's breakdown for They Create Worlds. He did a 1 or 2 episodes on the history of Sega. That was a messed up deal.
Yep, and I'll be covering all that same thing in 1 chapter too.
Nice.
And then also you said the very last thing here that Larry Kaplan was co-founder of Activision. He was not. And this something I pointed out on my Twitter threads before. The 4 founders of Activision are Jim Levy, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, and Alan Miller. Larry Kaplan backed out at the last second, then came back late.
Good point. I should have known that. I think I've made that mistake once before already. So
yeah, I think so. But that will conclude for January of 1982, and we're going to see you next time in January 1992 because you can't escape, Carl. You can never escape.
No, I can't, and I wouldn't want to. I'd miss our little conversation.
Well, I'm glad that you take your suffering in stride.
I do. Okay, Ethan. Hey, thank you for your service.
See ya.
So how does it feel, Carl, to correct the Department of Corrections?
It's a nice feeling.
Yeah.
I dig it, especially when it's about my favorite computer of all time, the Commodore 64.
Yes.
So, I mean, I love my Amiga, but let's face it, there's only one C64, and it is Grad.
It is indeed, but the Amiga is, I mean, I can't choose. I love them both.
No, I love them both too, but, it's one of those things that if I had to be buried with one, it's definitely a bread box.
Okay.
That's all there's to it. There's just something about that beautiful little round gray machine that even to this day, every time I boot up that blue screen to put in a loading command, my heart just skips a beat. It's weird, but it's instinctive at this point.
There is definitely something special about the C64. We can agree to that.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we have a ton of stuff to do.
Yes.
We have to turn on the time machine. And as much as I want to go and talk about the really cool stuff in 1982, we have to start off much, much earlier.
Yes, indeed.
We need to turn the machine back, not 40, not 30, not 50. I went in the wrong order.
Yes.
Not 40, not 50, not 60, not 70, but 80 years ago.
Yes.
To February of 1942.
The very, very first title for today is Pinball Seizures Continue to Add Up. And this makes me laugh because I have a picture in my head of people getting seizures from playing pinball, and I'm not sure how that comes in here. But I'm guessing that's got nothing to do with it. Take it away, Carl.
It has nothing to do with it. Although, considering that pinball at that time was famous for lots of flashy lights, that's probably not all that uncommon of an occurrence. But yes. So, New York police reported on February 1st that they had already seized 3,261 pinball machines and issued nearly 1,600 summons for possession since the machines were banned, as we reported last month. Further bans in New Jersey have also been deemed legal by the courts, with seizures beginning immediately.
So you and I touched on this earlier in an earlier episode. This was because the pinball machines were seen as gambling machines, right?
Well, at this point they are. The flippers don't exist yet.
Yeah.
So, and they're mainly just games of chance, but most of the devices are not specifically designed for payout, but quite often different establishments will pay out rewards. There's this whole big history on this, but the really big issue here is that they've been a public nuisance in many people's eyes for a very long time, and now that World War II has started for the United States, in December we had Pearl Harbor, so now with all the drives to acquire materials for the war, which, I mean, when I'm looking through the old New York Times newspapers at this point, there are tons of little ads everywhere, little cartoons and stuff for, collect your newspaper, collect your tin cans, whatever. And, donate them as war material.
Yeah.
And so this has given those local officials, especially Mayor LaGuardia of New York, who the airport's named after.
Mm-hmm.
He's really jumped on this bandwagon, and basically, now he's got his excuse. It's a patriotic duty to get rid of the machines, and they're just going to make sure these things disappear, and all the wiring and metal in them is going to go to the war effort.
Yes.
Yeah. So, pinball, public enemy number one. Okay, that's enough for 1942. Let's jump forward 10 years to February of 1952.
New York police commissioner takes sledgehammer to gambling machines.
Oh, yeah. 10 years later, it still hasn't ended.
Yes.
Over 200 pinball machines and an additional 200-plus gumball and nut machines, in addition to some one-armed bandits that were seized over the last 2 years, were destroyed by the NYPD.
So when I'm thinking gumball machines, I'm thinking these little round glass things that you put a coin in, you twist the handle, and then a gumball comes out.
Bingo.
Surely that can't be. Why would they destroy those? What's wrong with those?
Very simple. The idea here is, as far as I can tell, that the entire coin-operated business is seen as being part of the mafia.
Okay.
And the 50s, is when you're starting to get sort of this, trying to finally, push back on the mob in a big way. And so essentially, these are machines that were probably confiscated because the same guys who are running the gambling machines were also running the gumball machines and the nut machines and all this other stuff. So every time that they would bust one of these guys, they'd take all of their equipment.
Yeah.
And instead of reselling them to ostensibly other illegitimate businesses, they're just destroying the whole lot of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's pretty crazy.
So, next piece of news from 1952 is magnetic tape drives automated clerical worker. Is that what it's supposed to say? Yeah.
Well, drives is the verb here.
Yes.
So the magnetic tape is driving automatic clerical worker.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. Sorry.
Not a magnetic tape drive, but the magnetic tape drives the automated clerical worker.
Exactly.
Wonderful.
Hey, this stuff doesn't write itself, and unfortunately, I'm not the best writer. So Potter Instruments claims to have developed the first printer using magnetic tape technology as opposed to punch cards. Their new system can print out the entire text of Gone with the Wind in under 2 hours by relaying the data stored on tape through a system of vacuum tubes to a Marge printer armed with cast metal hammers. They see automation of clerical work as the future, as the costs of clerical workers has doubled or even tripled.
So this printer would print by like an old typewriter, if I understand it correctly. It has like these little hammers with the letters already on it that it puts down, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, nice.
So they're basically, I mean, think about it as like an old player piano.
Yeah.
Where it would have a paper tape running through with the holes in it that would then play certain keys.
Yep.
But now they're using magnetic tape. That's essentially giving you computer code in the most primitive fashion. And that's going through a series of vacuum tubes to activate certain keys, and then that creates this automated system. And the fact that this is coming out because clerical workers are becoming scarce, are becoming more expensive. This is partially because you've got the baby boom generation being born. You've got all these women who had been in the workforce, especially during the war years, now moving out to the suburbs, getting married and so forth. So the clerical work that had traditionally been done by young women in the cities is now no longer available. And this company is seeing this as a potential way of updating that and using this brand new new technology on a clerical level really is a question of cost. And the fact that they can do this already with magnetic tape and vacuum tubes is a sign of, number one, the cost of this type of technology is coming down, but also it's only coming down far enough in relationship to the increased cost of labor. Yeah. So automation in the workplace in the white collar office in 1952, I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, pretty nice for 1952.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So
ready to jump ahead another 10 years?
Yes, February of 1962.
RCA reveals new experimental IC.
Oh yeah. RCA has revealed that, as part of a U.S. Air Force-funded project, they have managed to create a new microcircuit by using metal ink, that's in quotation marks, on a ceramic disc to create a circuit that is 1/3 the size of an aspirin tablet. This would become the first experimental MOS integrated circuit with 16 transistors per chip.
Wow, that's actually quite good, eh?
Oh yeah.
Again, for 62.
This is basically the beginning. This is where, the MOS process, the metal oxide, what is it? What's the S stand for again?
I forget.
Metal oxide something or other. This is how well prepared we are, people. Come on, we were just talking about Commodore, and MOS Technologies is, kind of in the name, and now I can't remember what what it stands for, but
it's a metal oxide semiconductor, of course.
Thank you, metal oxide semiconductor, and this chip is essentially the beginning of that process. So you got 16 transistors in 1/3 the size of an aspirin. That is huge. Yeah. Now, to be clear, this is an experimental thing, and they won't actually manage reliable manufacturing until the early 70s. So it's going to take 10 years before this process becomes stable enough to really mass produce these things. And the theoretical foundations for this process had already been set out in the 1920s partially. So people have been talking about being able to pull this off for almost 40 years at this point.
Yeah.
Or different variations on this. But they finally kind of cracked the code. And RCA, most people know them as television manufacturers or radio manufacturers.
Yes.
But, we've talked about it here on the show many, many times that in the late 70s, early 80s, they were also very big in the computer business, had several machines of their own. And so, seeing that they're such an important part of this early development is kind of cool.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So let's jump forward another 10 years, since we just talked about the early 70s, to February of 1972.
Yeah, we've got quite a lot to cover there.
Yeah. It's 72, we're starting to get into, we've talked already about computer spaces out at this point. The stuff is really accelerating. I may actually have to shift everything around on the episodes and kill the 20-year jump and add a 50-year jump episode. I'm not sure yet, but we'll see how things develop.
Yeah. So the first one is handcrafted core memory is here to stay.
At least according to Popular Electronics. A wonderful one-page feature on the manufacturing of core memories, the type that are the backbone of virtually all of the 50,000 computers in the world at the time, shows off photos of the needles threading the small wires through the iron core that will allow data to be stored for processing in computers. The article mentions that some IC-based memory is coming onto the market, but they can't compete with the economics of iron cores, and given the massive number of existing computers using iron cores, they will no doubt be with us for many years to come.
So now we see that the IC we just saw being experimented with 10 years before still hasn't been superseded, hasn't superseded the iron cores here.
No, not yet.
For this part, at least.
No, and this is one of those moments where those ICs are finally breaking through. They're finally being able to mass produce them, And this idea that, well, we already have 50,000 computers using this stuff, these giant metal cores, and they have these legions of women just, putting the metal threads through them and stuff. Nobody's just going to simply dump all these machines and replace them. Basically, the iron core is going to be dead within 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the IC is going to just take everything over, and the existing computers are either going to be adapted into it or replaced with much, much cheaper models.
Yeah.
But it's
and much smaller ones as well.
But that's the thing. I mean, these iron cores didn't hold jack for memory, and they were huge.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, you've got the microprocessor and the IC memory. Forget about it. Everything's done at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really cool that it just happened to coincide nicely this way, and I was like, this is serendipity episode.
So next piece of news is that electronic text editing is coming to Newsroom.
Yes, the Harris Intertype Corporation has revealed their new Harris 1500 Editorial Input Terminal, a dumb terminal that allows reporters to write their stories directly on screen, processed by a PDP-11, edited by an editor, and then forwarded to typesetting.
So actual real editing, text editing. So somebody would write on the PDP-11 and an editor would pick it up and actually be able to rewrite it and then send it to the typesetting.
Yeah, and this also dovetails nicely with the story we just talked about from 52. With the clerical work and the printing out automation and stuff. Yeah. So what the real key here is that you're going to have the reporters writing something on their dumb terminal being stored on the server, the PDP-11, their editor being able to access the same file, make changes to it, and then that file being able to be accessed by the people doing the typesetting.
Yes.
And so this is really one of the first practical implementations I can see. I've found one of the first commercial implementations of what we basically take for granted today. I mean, we're both in different countries, but we're reading the same set of notes that I wrote on a Google Doc.
Yes.
And this is basically the same thing, but 50 years ago.
Yep. Well,
and
Google Docs is a bit more futuristic than what we started with back on the C64, by the way. So
definitely. But I mean, these are super expensive machines. Each one of these terminals costs like $1,500 or something. I mean, prices were someplace in the article. It's been a while since I read this, but and they're going to start by implementing this in a couple of smaller newspapers, sort of as test markets. But the fact that this is very quickly going to become a standard for large newspapers is really kind of, kick-ass, a huge move forward. Obviously, the typesetting itself is going to take a while to become digitized. But this is already a huge step, leap forward.
Yeah, definitely needed in a business like that.
Oh, definitely.
Computer industry expected to boom in 72.
After 2 years of relative dormancy, analysts expect computer sales to boom in 1972, growing to an estimated $9 billion, with most of the growth coming from inside the USA. The industry is predicted to become the biggest industry in the country in the decades to come.
Well, maybe it didn't boom in 72, but it's definitely the biggest industry these days, isn't it?
It is. It's one of the biggest industries. I mean, if not in number of people employed, it definitely in market value.
Yeah.
And it is interesting because it kind of started lagging, but it's with the ICs coming in. The size of the machines, the potency of the machines is going to change, and it really is going to take off. And you get this in several articles that I've been reading in the last few months in this time period, where people are really getting excited again about the potential of computers and what they have to offer. And let's put it this way. The politicians have also taken note, as our next story will tell us.
Yes. IBM comes under regulatory scrutiny.
As the computer industry gets bigger and more big data analysis occurs, antitrust regulators are beginning to look at IBM. Its dominance of all things data processing is beginning to alarm some in power, but how would you even break up such an intertwined company, and what effect would it have on the evolution of the industry and America's dominance of it?
It's funny, we've seen this happen a handful of times in the history of computing. Microsoft springs to mind as well at some point.
Yeah.
Being forced to split up the company somehow and remove stuff out of their OS. And why isn't this happening today with Google and Facebook? I ask myself. Maybe it is actually. So
well, there's been talk of it, and last month when we did the 40-year jump, so 10 years after this, we saw that they finally dropped the lawsuit against IBM. Okay. And it's because of this 10-year-long lawsuit against IBM that they did not request exclusivity on MS-DOS. Okay. This is the lawsuit that gives us the open platform we have today.
Yep.
And we're going to, as soon as we jump to 82, we're going to see a couple of stories related to that non-exclusivity on MS-DOS. Some very big, important stories. Because the IBM PC just came out a few months before, and already everybody's jumping on the bandwagon of MS-DOS. So, but at the same time, IBM has installed 53% of all computers outside the USA, and 71% of those installed inside the country. Now, granted, this is 1972. Computers are not, microcomputers. They are still big machines installed in companies and government institutions. But still, they have a stranglehold on it. And to your point about, why aren't we doing this with Google and so forth, it's primarily because, number one, the political will is no longer there to do it. The outside competition, and this was one of those things, the article, and remember everybody, all of the stories we're talking about, the links to the original articles are in the show notes. But this article from the New York Times talking about this does make this point that, well, if we broke up IBM and they're so dominant worldwide, would that not weaken America's dominance? Would the Japanese or the Germans be able to come in, or the English, and be able to take those contracts that would normally be controlled by an American company? Would America's economic position, and this is the height of the Cold War, be damaged if you did something against IBM? And those fears are still there today. I mean, what happens if the United States government breaks up Google? Will they be replaced? Will those services now be offered by maybe a Chinese company? Or a Russian company, and so on and so forth? And, is that the position you want to be in? And that is one of those arguments that lobbyists for these big companies have been pushing with U.S. politicians, and quite successfully, I might. It's like you may not like us, but at least we're from here.
Yes.
And we're recording this as Russia has invaded Ukraine, and cyber warfare is also going on. So, for all of those people in the future, this is February of 2022. And if you can still see this, it means in 20 years from now, it's the Third World War didn't break out. And if you are reading a transcript of this on your stone tablet, congratulations, it did. Okay. So that's it for the non-40-year jumps. Let's get to the main event.
Let's
turn on the time machine, and here we have our sound effects. So, boom.
Technology is 90s. Electronic video games. Entertainment business sales are generally lackluster. There is so much money to be made.
Welcome to February of 1982. Mads, what's our first story?
Bally is swimming in Pacman profits.
While Pac-Man arcade game sales totaled over $200 million in 1981, Bally, the U.S. licensee for the character from Namco, estimates that sub-licenses for other products will add up to a lot more over the coming years. In addition to Coleco's Mini Arcade, which will retail for $55 and may reach sales of over 500,000 units, netting Bally about $1.2 million, to say nothing of mugs, shoelaces, shirts, and Milton Bradley's upcoming board game, which they hope will lower the target age for the character from young teens and up down to 8 to 11-year-olds.
And we need to remember Kickman as well, of course, where Pac-Man and the Ghost made an appearance.
Yes, they hadn't included that. Well, this is actually coming from a New York Times article, which was interesting because the trades don't really look at all the sub-licenses.
No,
but
this was huge.
Yeah, this was the business section of the New York Times. And they were talking to an analyst who was trying, giving their estimates of, how much money this could really generate.
Yeah.
And Bally, is a huge company. They're into casinos and all this other stuff. So this one game generating this much money is really, an enormous deal. And yeah, especially the board game. I hadn't even thought about it, but the board game did lower the access age.
I remember the board game actually from when I was a kid. One of my friends had that.
Yeah, one of my friends had it too, and I remember playing it and enjoying it. And it was also at a time when I did not have a game console. I only went to the arcade, once every couple of months with my folks, Chuck E. Cheese. So this was my entry point. So that when the cartoon came on, I actually knew it best from that board game. And so this really was like, I played that when I was like 6. Maybe 7. So yeah, it totally worked.
Yeah.
Cool stuff.
Pac-Man was everywhere. So, and of course it's on our second part of the news as well. It's Mastering Pac-Man hits the bestseller charts.
Mastering Pac-Man by Ken Houston has hit number 11 on the paperback charts.
I feel you've covered this one before. Not that it hit number 11, but you and I talked about that book before, haven't we?
Yes, we just talked about it last month or the month before. That there was this whole slew of books about playing games and mastering games that are coming out. Some of these will also become the first books talking about gaming history, because they'll be adding little tidbits about the history of games into the books.
Yeah.
And so from our standpoint, as talking about the history of stuff and trying to unearth the history, some of these books will be the first inklings of that. And these books, are really shooting up. I have here a quick little side note also from the paperback charts. 4th place was The Simple Solution to Rubik's Cube. Also one of these, solve the game things. And just as a side note, the trade paperback list has 4 Garfield collections on it. And in addition to The Simple Solution, it also has another book on the Rubik's Cube. So there's 2 Rubik's Cube games books on here, and 4 Garfield books in addition to the Mastering Pac-Man book.
I used to love Garfield back in the day, but as somebody who knows how to solve Rubik's Cubes, it blows my mind that you can publish a whole book on it, because it's not that hard.
As somebody who never figured it out, you can make a lot of money selling those books. They had a ton of them back in the day.
I bet I could describe it in about, give me 4 A4 pages. I could probably draw you some pictures of how to do it.
It's just like, how can you sell an entire book on Pac-Man?
Yes, true.
But because you have a minimum size necessary for being placed on a bookshelf, you can pad that out with a ton of graphics, add like 50 pictures of the cube and all this other crap, and then you got it. But also Rubik's Cube was just so unbelievably popular at the time.
Yeah, I remember. I got one about that time. Well, maybe beginning of the 80s, maybe mid-80s. And back then I never learned how to solve it, because, of course, today we have the internet. So you can Google it, you can have a look, you can try to learn it, and then you can memorize the solutions. But back then, you'd have to try to figure it out yourself or buy one of these books. So actually, I do get it. Back in the day, that would have been how I would have learned to solve it.
And now you understand the popularity of it. I mean, it was YouTube before YouTube.
Yes. So in other news, token wars ensue.
With the bombastic rise of the arcade business, many hotly contested markets are seeing token wars as arcades try to lure players with bargain exchange rates for their dollars. One arcade in Southern California went as far as offering 12 tokens for $1 in a hotly contested market. Big-time games distributor Sandy Beetleman says the influx of inexperienced operators are causing problems even for distributors and thinks the market has hit a plateau. Another distributor says that he thinks 1982 will be a weeding out year.
So people will be going out of business because they're driving the prices down.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's so many people, and we talked about this last month, and we just talked about it a little bit in the Department of Corrections. There's a ton of scam companies. We talked about this last month, the blue sky companies, as they're calling them, and all these people are trying to get a piece of this action. There's going to be a quote from Ronald Reagan very soon where he's going to say that he wished the entire economy was doing as well as the arcade business. And, of course, we're going to have a crash in the arcade business very, very soon.
Yeah.
Okay. The crash that's coming at the end of 82 in the console business is also going to hit the arcade business. Mm. And it has to do with the fact that there's only so many quarters out there. There's only so many good games. We've talked about it a few times now on the show, how there's all these games coming out, but really at the end of the day, there's very, very few hits that are really covering the costs.
Yes.
And as companies are trying to push the envelope, offering better effects, more pizzazz to get gamers' attention, well, that's upping the cost of the machines. I mean, you're just exponentially using faster and faster CPUs, more memory, and all this stuff. That just makes the product more expensive, and if it fails, that just means the loss is that much bigger.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And of course, this is also before the designers of arcade games really learned how to hone that craft of pulling the quarters out of people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it at this point is just, luck. These guys, I mean, you've got people you've got guys making games like Defender, for example, which are unbelievably profitable games. You've got Pacman, which is an unbelievably profitable game. But, did they really have, like an algorithm to figure it out? Or is it just, we built it, we put it on site, and it really took off? How much of it is luck at this point? And how much can you really test market something like this?
I'm also thinking of something as simple as continuing in a game. I mean, that was 2 or 3 years down the line still for that to be commonplace. And when we got there, I mean, that's when the quarters really started to flow, because you pop in a quarter, you'd play for 10 minutes because you're good at this game, and then you'd die, and then you'd want to continue the game. So you'd pop in another quarter, die 2 minutes later, pop in another quarter, live for a minute more.
Well, actually, we've already covered that on a couple of months ago. The first game to do that is already out.
Yes. But it's
not going to become commonplace for another year or two. Yeah. I mean, Donkey Kong is out right now, but it doesn't have that feature. I mean, right now it's all about high score chasing.
Exactly.
But the problem is, as soon as you have that buy-in, the high score gets diminished, because the high score is no longer a symbol of how good you are at the game. It's how much money you put into it.
Yep.
And also these games that are just, the same level repeated 50 times but a little bit faster lose their appeal if you can buy in.
Yes.
Where buy-in really pays off is, when you get to games like Final Fight, where every level's got new graphics and the story continues and you want to see how it ends. But that requires an immense amount of memory in comparison with what these machines can offer.
Yeah.
And that's kind of that balancing act that we're not quite at yet.
We need to get to the mid 80s, like 86 with Bubble Bubble, for example.
Stuff like that. Yeah, dude.
Then it really becomes something.
Yeah, and that's going to be post-Crash. We're going to see an evolution there. But that also goes to this idea that I was talking about, that the hardware is getting so much better so fast, right? And at this point, there's going to be a shakeout. There's going to be a lot of operators who are going to disappear. There's also a lot of game makers that are not going to get past the Crash. And the ones who are going to be left are going to have enough capital to really make some investments and to advance the technology enough to create product that people are willing to put their money into, and the operators can have enough trust in that it'll make their money back. But that's stuff for the next 12 to 13 months worth of the show. So
So before we get there, Stern wins big in court.
That's right. The United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in New York has ruled in favor of Stern Electronics in their case against scramble copier Bay Coin Distributors out of Queens. The main issue of the case revolved around confirmation of the idea that the graphics stored in chip memory of the game board were legitimate copyrightable works, as opposed to just the completed image as assembled by the program on screen, which varied based on user input from game to game. This decision recognized that the graphics and sounds were independent of the code, which was an already established and protected copyrightable work.
Oh, okay. So the actual code was copyrighted, but this says that the graphics, the sprites stored in chip memory as well, could be copyrighted as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the code copyrights go way back because you had mainframe programs and stuff that had been copyright protected. But video games add this additional component where you have separate files with the graphics and sound that are actually just called upon by the code, but they're not integrated into the code. And so far, what the decisions had been based upon largely was the early decisions were, well, the stuff on the screen, because traditional copyright says what is protected is the expression of the creative idea. And so this is how you could copyright the individual frames of a movie or the individual notes in a song. Because of the order that they're played in and what is on those images. But because a video game changes each time, a lot of copiers were arguing that it wasn't, that copyright couldn't protect it, that you would either need a new law to cover this, and until then, you could copy somebody else's stuff as long as you didn't copy the code.
Yeah.
And what the judge here parsed out was these individual sprites. The image on the screen that is influenced by the player is not what they ruled on, but the individual sprites of the ships and the rockets and the terrain, those are copyrightable. So if you copy those, it doesn't matter what this player does with them afterwards, it's still protected. And this gets around the idea that the player is influencing the total image because each one of these tiny little components is still a copyrightable work. Yeah.
Okay.
Very important decision. It's going to be very influential going forward.
Yeah. Lots of copying going on that back then. So.
Oh yeah.
So speaking of the courts, Atari isn't as lucky as Stern because Atari gets trounced in court.
Atari sued against Amusement World, a small maker of coin-op games out of Eldersburg, Maryland, and its 27-year-old president, Stephen D. Holnicker, has been decided by the judge in Amusement World's favor. Amusement World released a game, Meteor, a full-color raster game about a ship blowing up space rocks that break into smaller space rocks. Atari sued, claiming that the game was too similar to asteroids, but the judge rejected this argument as copyright does not protect ideas but their expression, and the idea of blowing up space rocks is not unique enough on its own to be protected, and the implementation between the two games differs enough to be unique.
Okay, sounds fair enough, but I haven't seen the actual game there. Is it an Atari, an Asteroids clone?
Yes and no, and there's actually a video of it. Holniker passed away a few years ago, but his son actually owns and runs a retro arcade and game shop. Oh, and there's a link in the show notes to a YouTube video where he's actually plugging in maybe the last Meteor cabinet that exists for the first time in like 40 years and plays a couple rounds of the game. And so on first glance, obviously it's top down. You see the ship from above. You see the rocks floating around. The big differences are number one, it's a raster screen. It's not using a vector screen. So everything's full color. And from what I could see on the movement, there is no inertia. So if you push forward with your ship, you move forward. The moment you stop, the ship stops, which obviously completely changes the dynamic of the game.
Yeah.
And I think
it makes it a lot more playable because that's the hardest part of Asteroids.
Exactly. That's one of the hard parts about Asteroids. And at the same time, this is probably, and this is pure speculation on my part, but it's probably the big element that changed the way or influenced the judge to decide the way he. Yeah. Amusement World, I don't think makes any other games after this. This lawsuit pretty much cost them so much that they couldn't keep going. But the fact that they won and that this distinction was made between, the expression and the raw idea is one of those things that does continue on, and why so many games start to get more complex in their backstories and all this other stuff, because you need to be able to distinguish your product from everybody else's.
Yeah. This is definitely inspired by Asteroids. I'm looking at the video right now, but it looks a lot better. I play this.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to give it a go too. I'd have to check and see if it's already been dumped on MAME. I can't imagine it hasn't been, but wouldn't surprise me if it hasn't. Yeah.
Interesting. So let's get out of the arcades and talk about some Barbie dolls. Mattel announces games for the VCS.
Oh yeah, Mattel, maker of the Intellivision, has announced that it will be releasing games that will work on Atari's VCS. The games would ultimately be released under the M Network label, and some existing Intellivision games, such as Astro Smash, would be renamed into, for example, Astro Blast.
Okay. So any good games come out of that?
We got ports of things like Burger Time onto the Atari 2600.
Yep.
Lock and Chase. Some Mattel tie-ins like the Masters of the Universe.
Yes.
Come over, and Mattel had also locked down the rights to the movie Tron, which is also coming up pretty soon. And they released a bunch of games, some of them on the 2600s, some of them on the Intellivision, and some on both. So some of this stuff does get ported. I believe even at least one of their AD&D games, or not AD&D at this point, just Dungeons and Dragons games, also gets a port to the 2600 this way.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, we talked last year about how Activision was the first third party. We know there's a couple other companies already getting in on the VCS unlicensed game market.
Yep.
And everybody's figured out ways to get around or figure out how to design games. And the VCS market is just so huge, and television is such a small portion of them that it just makes sense for them to, exploit this and in some ways, get their inferior looking versions of the games onto the VCS. Because worst case scenario, you can still say, hey, if you like the game on the VCS, check out the more feature-filled, prettier version on the Intellivision.
Yeah. Only problem with the Intellivision was those god-awful controllers.
Yes, and yes. It's the god-awful controllers. The fact that they're cable connected to the frickin' box.
Yep.
And that's basically the problem with the Intellivision. And we're going to see the same business model pop up with Coleco, but we're looking here. This is news coming out, New York Times in February. By the end of the year, there's going to be so many manufacturers. This is what's going to cause the crash. We're in the year of the crash. And here you already see everybody's going to be dumping games onto the VCS.
Yes, yeah. So much crap on the VCS.
Oh, yeah.
So leaving the console market, let's get into computers. IBM and MCA dump DiscoVision.
IBM and MCA had teamed up to bring DiscoVision, their brand of Laserdisc players and discs, to the U.S. market back in 1978. After having sold only 70,000 consumer and some 25,000 industrial players, the two companies have decided to sell off the company to Pioneer and call it a day.
So I never knew they made the Laserdisc players.
Oh, yeah.
Pioneer was definitely the brand I saw back in the day.
Well, and DiscoVision was also the brand that made that released Roller Coaster, which was the game that you played.
Yes.
And also kind of explains why they didn't want to cooperate on a CES show booth showing off the potential of connecting a computer to DiscoVision, because MCA and IBM were trying to wash their hands of this.
Okay.
And IBM had always seen it as, really a way of distributing mass data with the potential of computer connectivity or of some nature. But yeah, it just hasn't taken off the way they were hoping it would.
Okay.
And yeah.
So do you know how much storage was actually on one of those discs? What could you store on there?
Well, it was an analog format.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you could really break it down into megabytes.
Well, you could it depends on the way you store it, of course. If there was one way of serializing data for it, I guess you could give it a size. But
you would have to do it sound-wise the same way you would do a cassette.
Like with cassette tapes, yeah.
Yeah. So if I think it was you got maybe 30 minutes on each side of the disc. So it really wasn't an advantageous option.
Okay.
I mean, it worked for things like the roller coaster game that you played, Adventures in Videoland, where you're grabbing this video data and using it interstitially with Text Adventure or some other kind of program. But if you wanted to use it for raw data, you're better off with a cassette tape.
Okay.
From a cost standpoint, from a amount of memory, the only advantage is the jumping around, but then you're probably just as well off with a vinyl record of maybe. This really was something that without going to a proper ROM version like with DVD, it just wasn't really a viable option, unfortunately. Unless you could do some kind of compression, but then you would need a processor capable of that. And that's probably also where you're going to fall flat on your face.
Yeah. Interesting. I love old media. maybe I need to get myself a Laserdisc at some point.
It would be interesting. There's a lot of cool old bonus features on the Laserdiscs that are hard to come by.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So it says on Wikipedia that in 1994, actually, Sony introduced a Laserdisc format that could store 3.28 gigabytes.
Per side or on a whole disc?
It doesn't say. Say.
Yeah, because that flipping of the disc would be the issue.
Yeah. But still, that's a lot of storage for 84.
Yeah, for 94, that's huge. When does DVD come out? Is that like 90?
This was 84. 99? This was 84.
Oh, 84.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. See, now that would have been really, really freaking cool if the access speed was there.
Yeah, it probably wasn't. Oh, well. But I digress. Let's go to the next piece of news. Fortune 3216 brings the 68,000 to desktops. One
of the earliest 68,000 powered desktop computers, the Fortune 3216, was shown off at Comdex. With 128K of memory, the ability to be outfitted with a hard drive and a 32-bit data and address register, as well as 16-bit data bus, the $5,000 Butte may be the killer Unix computer of the 80s.
Wow. that price? I mean, considering inflation from so many years ago.
Triple it at least.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, plus the inflation we got right now. Yeah, triple, 3.5 times.
Crazy prices, but yeah, must have been a beast of a machine. Of course, this is some years before we get stuff like the Amiga. That you could actually buy for homes with a 68,000 processor in it.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, the 68,000 processor has been around since '79. And I may be wrong on this, but this is the first time I've run across an actual desktop computer using the 68,000.
Okay. I've never heard about the Fortune 3216 before.
I hadn't either. And the company, this was interesting. I kind of went down a rabbit hole for a couple of days on this one. So the company has this gangbusters IPO. They managed to garner over $100 million from the IPO. But then the crash of '83 happened. So we're going to see a video game crash in '82. We're going to see a home computer, a microcomputer crash in '83.
Okay.
Really bad one.
Okay.
And the management shakeup that comes out of that, because they did the IPO, the original founders basically lose control of the company, and it's a bunch of investors.
Yeah.
And they do what investors always do. Instead of trying to weather the storm, they cut everything. A bunch of new products get delayed. And so by the time they get everything back up and running, the Atari ST is on the market, the Amiga is on the market, the IBM has completely evolved into a different beast from the old XTs into ATs. And by the time they get new product onto the market in '87, it's too late and they just disappear. The company collapses.
Yeah, too bad.
Yeah. And I had never heard about it. Now, as far as I can tell, the machines have no graphic mode. It's purely text.
Yeah.
I did read something about an add-on card for some kind of monochrome graphics, but still, 68,000 processor at this point, not too shabby.
Not too shabby at all.
Yeah, and also the fun part that they're using the 3216, because we're going to see those two numbers referenced in the name of another famous 68,000 machine.
Yes, indeed.
The Atari ST.
So speaking of chips, AMD signs deal to produce Intel chips.
Oh, yes. Advanced Micro Devices is a second source chip maker best known for their Z8000 16-bit manufacturing, but they have now signed a 10-year deal to manufacture Intel's line of 16 and 32-bit chips, including the 8086.
And today they design their very own chips. Of course, they did that already in the late 80s. Is that when they began? Or is it?
Well, what's going to happen is when their 10-year deal is up, they're going to simply start making clones of those chips that they learned to make so well. And that's going to be a big series of lawsuits. But it is going to establish AMD as the counterpart to Intel.
Oh, yeah. And that must be you're right, after the 10 years, because that must be in the beginning of the 90s.
Exactly.
I remember those CPUs coming on the market.
Exactly. It's going to be, it probably starts a little bit before that, but they're going to use what they've learned from the 8086 manufacturing to basically start making their own compatible chips.
Yes. Intel's
going to sue. There's going to be lots of back and forth, but ultimately AMD will still be on the market making chips.
So I remember switching completely to AMD CPUs in maybe mid-90s, 96 maybe, because they were so much cheaper. So I've had a K6 and K6-2 and K7 and what was the 64-bit one called? I've just been AMD all the way.
To be honest with you, I've probably had I don't even know. I may have had one AMD chip along the way. Otherwise, I've always been an Intel guy.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was just because I don't even know why. Just always stuck with the Intel chips. But yeah.
I'm running a Ryzen right now, so
nice.
I've stuck with the AMD, I think.
Yeah, I got an old i3 in this box right here. So go figure.
So, speaking of Intel chips, Intel to distribute MS-DOS with systems.
Intel has announced that it will be shipping both Microsoft's DOS and CP/M operating systems with a variety of its chips and systems. This will help make both OSs widely available.
DOS becomes the major platform there.
Well, and that's the interesting thing. Byte Magazine, and this is where the article comes from, they suggest that this will ensure that both operating systems survive in parallel for quite a while. But in another news article in the same issue, we've talked before about the launch of the IBM PC, how it had different operating systems that you could order your machine with. But the cheaper one was what they were calling PC-DOS, which is actually MS-DOS.
Yeah.
And it turns out CP/M, which was the de facto standardized operating system at this point, well, there's the CP/M 80, which was made for the Z80 processors. That's why there was also a Z80 add-on card released by Microsoft for the Apple II, so you could run CP/M on an Apple II. CP/M 80 software seems to be a little bit difficult to port to CP/M 86, which is the version for the IBM PC, for the 8086 processors. And nobody seems to be able to really get it to work, whereas people porting software to MS-DOS seems to be super easy. So even programs coming from CP/M going to MS-DOS seems to be working without a problem. And Byte notes that so far the software being released for the IBM PC seems to be exclusively for MS-DOS, that they hadn't run across any professional software released for CP/M on the IBM PC.
I surely never ran into CP/M back in the day. It was always some kind of variant of DOS that was on these old systems.
Well, and that's because CP/M never makes it past the Z80.
Okay.
It's not a factor outside of the Z80 microcosm, and that's because Gary Kildall screwed up and did not take IBM's call.
Yep.
He just was like, no, you guys can come back another day. And, well, Bill Gates took the call.
Yep.
I'm oversimplifying. I know. There's more to that story, but not much. He was a little overconfident.
Yes. So in other news, everyone wants to be compatible.
Yeah. Franklin Computer Corporation has introduced a new Apple II compatible computer system. While it won't be able to reproduce Apple's color graphics, that would require patent infringement, they will offer more memory at $300 less than Apple's machine. This is part of a larger trend, with several Japanese companies announcing IBM-compatible machines in the making, Commodore promising machines that will run CP/M software developed for IBM and Apple computers, and Coleco announcing at CES that their new game console, the ColecoVision, will be able to play Atari VCS titles as well as their own game cards.
So being a technical guy, this sounds crazy. I mean, that there's so much work involved in trying to make stuff like that compatible with each other. But of course, back in the ecosystem as it was back in those days, it makes sense because there were so many different systems, and it was a huge problem, an increasing problem for consumers that whenever they bought something new, everything they had in their software library from before would have to be changed, right?
Exactly. I mean, well, we went through it as well. If you upgraded from a Commodore 64 to an Amiga, your entire software library was gone.
Yeah, and when I went from my Amiga to the PC, it was gone once more.
Exactly. And the dream of emulation. And this is one of the things, this is all coming out of an article in the New York Times talking about this. And it actually suggests that emulation could be the solution to this problem. So this is 1982. They're talking about how software emulation might be the solution to all of these issues. And it had long been an option already on mainframes to bypass hardware incompatibility. Because remember, almost all those old mainframes were standalone machines to some extent. Even if you had IBM had certain standards for parts and stuff between some of their models, when you had the software was often custom-made, bespoke software that would not work. So just trying to even get, a database from one system running on another was almost impossible without an emulator. And that they're suggesting that might be the solution to create a universally compatible system because, and this is again the New York Times article, they're saying it's extremely unlikely that the major operating systems such as MS-DOS, CP/M, and Unix will ever give up territory to one. And the fact that this pressure is already clear here is going to be one of the reasons for the big crash of 8, where all these different computer systems cannot survive. And one of the only ones that comes out of it intact is the Commodore 64 in North America, and the IBM PC. So it's one of those things where at this point it's inconceivable to anybody that one operating system will win, but that's essentially what's going to end.
Okay, so more state school systems choose Apple.
Colorado, Oregon, and Florida have all awarded contracts to Apple to deliver microcomputers for their school systems.
So this would still be Apple IIs being delivered to the schools.
Oh, yes. Apple IIs. I mean, the Apple III is out there, but it's a complete shit show. And, so we've talked before about how Apple has been pushing the educational market in their direction. They had a lot of support early on from Minnesota, which was always a forerunner in this area. And we've also talked about how Atari has been really pushing to get some of these contracts as well. But Apple keeps, grabbing more and more of these systems and putting them under their control. And they're going to control the school systems well into the 90s.
So the school kids get some more computers to play the Oregon Trail on.
Basically, that's what it comes down to.
That's good. So Commodore to spend over $5 million on Shatner ad.
Yes, we talked about the Shatner ad last month, but Commodore is going for the game consoles with a massive nationwide ad campaign featuring William Shatner attacking both Atari and Intellivision. The ad will spoof the two systems' rivalry by asking consumers why buy a game system when you can buy a computer for under $300.
Yep, that would be the VIC-20.
Yeah, and like I said, we talked about this last month already, that Shatner was the spokesperson for Commodore. He shows up in print ads for the PET line. He shows up in TV ads for the VIC. And we also had a link already last month to this specific ad where Atari and Intellivision have been going at each other in the ads, and Shatner beams in between the two and says, why are you even bothering? There's a computer that plays great games for $300 in his nice Shatnerish voice. And the fact that this ad is going to cost $5 million, especially for Commodore, which is a company never known for big ad budgets. It just kind of was like, wow, that's a big number.
Yeah, and of course, 82 is the year where the C64 comes out as well.
C64, I mean, CES already happened in January. The reports in the magazines are coming. Like I said, the New York Times briefly mentions the ColecoVision.
Yeah.
But we don't have the reports from CES are going to start next month and are primarily going to hit in May. So we still have a little bit ways before we get those full reports.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the Commodore 64, at least the chipset gets shown. I'm still trying to piece together if they actually had a working Commodore 64 at the CES.
Yeah.
What we do know, and we have video footage of, is a machine called the Ultra Max, which is using the same chipset as the C64, but with less memory. It was ultimately then released in Japan as the Max computer, sort of like think of the insides, the muscle of a Commodore 64, but with far less memory, that was supposed to be like a successor to the VIC-20. And that was shown off in live demos at the convention. Whether or not the C64 was...
it actually says, at least on Wikipedia, that it was introduced in January 82 at CES.
Yeah, well, that's the thing.
In some form, at least.
The Commodore 64 was mentioned. Whether or not they had a working prototype is another issue.
Yep.
But we know that the Ultramax didn't have 64K of RAM in it.
Okay.
Because the guy who actually owns it still has it. There's pictures of it. And we have a German television news report from that CES showing it being demonstrated.
Okay.
And the color combinations on the screen are not the same. So it's but the January CESs are always about showing early demos of products to see how much interest there is from the retailers. It's never really about having the final product already ready to go.
Okay.
That's what the summer CES is for.
That means the C64 is turning 40 this year. I feel old.
Oh yeah, the C64. I mean, most people have already celebrated that 40th anniversary, but yeah. I mean, granted, I don't get mine until early 85, like February of 85, January or February of 85. But yeah, it's kind of scary that it's already 40 years old.
Yes.
Wow.
Indeed.
Yeah. Too much fun.
So, getting out of computers and to the last category for today, I guess the FCC gives the go-ahead to cellular radio.
After 13 years of deliberations, the FCC has given its blessing to a plan that would allow the rollout of cellular phone service in the USA. This plan would see half of all frequencies be reserved for existing phone companies, mainly the newly created Baby Bells, and half would be made available to other companies. This has sparked controversy over the unfairness of the ruling, but AT&T seems happy, promising to begin rollout in the first city this year.
So what was the Baby Bells?
We talked about this briefly 2 months ago. So together with the IBM antitrust case that had been running forever, there was also an antitrust case running against AT&T.
Yeah.
Or as it was called, Ma Bell, because it was originally the Bell phone company.
Yep.
And the idea was originally the U.S. had given a monopoly, and I'm oversimplifying here, but had given a monopoly control over telephone lines to this private company, Edison's Bell phone company. And they had the right then to put these phone lines everywhere. The one thing that they had to give as a concession was that local telephone calls had to be free, which is also how we get the backbone of dial-up internet booming in the early 90s in the United States. But that's another issue entirely. So after many, many years of being investigated for, price fixing and hampering the market for telecommunication services, the U.S. government finally brokered a deal with AT&T a couple months before this, where they broke up the companies. So they created regional smaller companies that would then be in charge of the local telephone service and infrastructure, but would be banned from offering long distance services. And the long distance service would remain with AT&T together with the telecommunication services. Okay. So data transfer services. And this breakup basically meant that it really helped the stock price of AT&T because maintaining all those wires is expensive.
Yeah.
So suddenly AT&T got rid of all of its actual expenses and just got to keep the profitable long distance services and so forth. In theory, now they also had to compete against other companies offering long distance services, but by the time those got up and running, that would be another 10 years. To be true competitors to AT&T.
Okay.
And this decision by the FCC to say, okay, we will allow cellular phones. We're going to reserve a section of the radio bandwidth for cellular phones comes after 13 years of deliberation. I mean, the tech was developed in the U.S. for cell phones. They've already rolled it out in Japan already in the 70s.
Okay.
But it's been stuck in this administrative limbo for all these years because they didn't want to give it to the monopoly company while the monopoly company was under investigation.
Oh, okay.
And so now
I guess
that
hampered the progress there.
Yeah. I mean, it was basically once the investigation was dropped and with Reagan is the one pushing for deregulation. Remember, he comes into power in they have the election in 1980, comes in 81. So he's basically just like, let the market decide, with the exception of the fact that here the let the market decide becomes AT&T gets half of the bandwidth.
Mm.
And all the other companies have to now fight over bandwidth.
Yes.
And so, yeah, it's going to be a one company business for a long, long time.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
So speaking of the government lawyers installed Space Invaders on office terminals.
Oh, yeah. In the wake of the AT&T case being dropped, as we reported last month, many lawyers in the Justice Department find themselves without assignments and have turned instead to playing Space Invaders, a version of which has been installed on their mainframe. According to one insider, the top 10 scoreboard is on the server and inter-office competition has developed.
So which kind of machines were they playing this on?
This would have been dumb terminals connected to a mainframe where they're essentially doing what we talked about in the 72 jump with the newsroom, where you edit legal documents and then have people review them.
Yeah.
Probably a PDP-11 or something along those lines. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a fun little side story. I thought it was definitely worth mentioning, and also because it plays into this idea of the AT&T case being dropped, because suddenly all these guys who had made a career, I mean, some of these cases were going for decades. Suddenly they had nothing to do because the Reagan administration was not going to be going after any businesses. They were going to let everybody do what they wanted. And all these career lawyers who were specialized in this area suddenly had nothing to do. Yeah.
So, mate, we're at the end, and before I'm going to try to save you from a correction from Ethan here, because I've just been looking at an InfoWorld issue from February 1st, 1982, and on the third page it says that, let's see, at the CES, Commodore introduced two new home computers, the Commodore 64, that squelched the rumors that they would not try to compete against the Apple II or the Atari 800, that would retail for $595 and have 64K of RAM, and so on and so forth. It has a lot of information here. So at least they had all the details, right? Maybe they didn't have a working prototype yet, though.
Yeah, no, the fact that they had all the details and the specs, that's not in question.
Okay.
For me, it's really just an issue. I haven't been able to confirm that they had a working model of the machine.
No.
That's the thing.
Of course, they will have that in August of 80.
Oh, they will definitely have that in August. Yeah. Yeah, and this is why that Ultramax prototype that's out there and the video footage of it is so interesting, because it is the chipset. And they even show, and we even know what the screen looked like. It's the traditional ready prompt with the same resolution and same character set that we know from the Commodore 64, only in a different color scheme. I think it's like black and green.
I've never heard of that Ultramax before.
Yeah, well, it only shows up. There's I'll send you a video of it. It'll show up again when we talk about it in a couple of months. But there is what's missing though is the two lines of text that we know from the Commodore 64 startup screen. Commodore Basic and with the amount of RAM that's missing. It's just ready at one empty line, then ready, and then the cursor.
Yeah.
So it's clearly a prototype. They're not 100% ready to go yet. So the fact that they knew what the hardware was going to be, that's without a shadow of a doubt. It's just that they had the chipsets to demonstrate. And the guy even shows, how the cartridges go in and stuff.
Yeah.
But what they don't have yet is an actual model. You don't see it in the bread bin, and it doesn't have function keys. The 4 function keys are not part of that Ultramax prototype.
Yeah, it says here the Ultimax will sell for $149.95. So it was cheap machine which would include a video game system and a music synthesizer. So something to compete with the VCS and Intellivision, it seems.
Yeah, and what they're really talking about there is the VIC-2 and the SID chip.
Yeah, must be.
Yeah, with the 2 joystick ports.
Yeah.
Which, as we know from the Commodore 64, was really just one joystick port with a sort of add-on, which is why the port 2 was always slower than the port 1.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a weird little thing. So if you actually do play, if you're really, really good, there's a split-second delay in the second port because they cheaped out and they didn't actually build a true second port. It's just kind of, I don't know the technical sides of it, but it is kind of feeding off of the other port because the VIC only had one port.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the Commodore 64 is this wonderful connection. It's the middle point of amazing engineering and cool high tech, and at the same time, unbelievably weird shortcuts.
Yes, to keep the costs down. Yes.
Yeah. It's just perfect Commodore. It's Commodore beauty at its best.
Sure.
Okay, so you have one more task, sir.
Yes.
Your word of the episode.
It'll have to be compatible.
Yes.
We've talked a lot about different kinds of compatibility here, so compatible.
Excellent. I love it. I dig it. Okay. So, everybody, thanks for listening. Thanks for sticking with us all the way through to the end. Remember, subscribe. Give us some love on whatever podcast service you're at. We don't get a lot of thumbs ups, 5 stars, or whatever. Just show us some love. Just a hi. You can also send us email, comments. We love getting them. Twitter and Instagram, and also remember, check out Mads 2 podcast because you don't want to be reading or listening to the news right now.
No.
Just let us talk about old stuff. Yes. It's much better at this point. Old
news. That's much better.
Because when the nuclear bombs do drop, you're going to die anyway. Wow, this just got depressing and fast. Okay. Mads, thanks as always.
Yeah, it was my pleasure, mate. Hopefully speak to you later soon.
Exactly, hopefully. Okay, bye.
Bye.